Hello, Brubs. We're back with Perfume, the story of a murderer by Patrick Suskind. Murderer. All right. We're somewhere in the second part of the book, section 30. Guess you'd call it chapter 30. I don't know. He looked awful. His hair reached down to the hollows of his knees, his scraggly beard to his navel. His nails were like talons, and the skin on his arms and legs, where the rags no longer covered his body, was peeling off in shreds. The first people he met, farmers in a field near the town of Pierrefort, ran off screaming at the sight of him, but in the town itself he caused a sensation. By the hundreds, people came running to gape at him. Many of them believed he was an escaped galley slave. Others said he was not really a human being, but some mixture of man and bear, some kind of forest creature. One fellow, who had been to sea, claimed that he looked like a member of a wild Indian tribe in Cayenne, which lay on the other side of the great ocean. They led him before the mayor. There, to the astonishment of the assembly, he produced his journeyman's papers, opened his mouth, and related in a few gabbled but sufficiently comprehensible words, for these were the first words that he had uttered in 7 years, how he had been attacked by robbers, dragged off, and held captive in a cave for 7 years. He had seen neither daylight nor another human being during that time, had been fed by an invisible hand that let down a basket in the dark, and finally set free by a ladder, without his ever knowing why and without ever having seen his captors or his rescuer. He had thought this story up since it seemed to him more believable than the truth, and so it was, for similar attacks by robbers occurred not infrequently in the mountains of the Auvergne and Languedoc, and in the savannas. I don't know how to say any of these French words. At least the mayor recorded it all without protest and passed his report on to the Marquis de la Tallade Espinasse, liege lord of the town and member of parliament in Toulouse. Thanks, buddy. I could never have gone on without those words of encouragement. Eyebrows. At the age of 40, the Marquis had turned his back on life at the court of Versailles and retired to his estates, where he lived for science alone. From his pen had come an important work concerning dynamic political economy. In it, he had proposed the abolition of all taxes on real estate and agricultural products, as well as the introduction of an upside down progressive income tax. Thank you, man. Thank you. That means so much. Which would hit the poorest citizens the hardest, and so force them to a more vigorous development of their economic activities. Encouraged by the success of his little book, he authored a tract on the raising of boys and girls between the ages of 5 and 10. Then he turned to experimental agriculture by spreading the semen of bulls over various grasses. He attempted to produce a milk yielding animal vegetable hybrid, a sort of udder flour. After initial successes that enable him to produce a cheese from his milk grass, described by the Academy of Sciences of Lyon as tasting of goat, though slightly bitter, he had to abandon his experiments because of the enormous cost of spewing bull semen by the hundreds of quarts across his fields. In any case, his concern with matters agrobiological had awakened his interest not only in the plowed clod, so to speak, but in the earth in general and its relationship to the biosphere in particular. He had barely concluded his work with the milk yielding udder flower when he threw himself with greater elan into unflagging research for a grand treatise on the relationship between proximity to the earth and vital energy. His thesis was that life could develop only at a certain distance from the earth, since the earth itself constantly emits a corrupting gas, a so-called fluidum letal, which lames vital energies and sooner or later totally extinguishes them. All living creatures therefore endeavor to distance themselves from the earth by growing. That is, they grow away from it and not, for instance, into it, which is why their most valuable parts are lifted heavenwards. The ears of grain, the blossoms of flowers, the head of man, and therefore, as they begin to bend and buckle back toward the earth in old age, they will inevitably fall victim to the lethal gas, into which they are in turn finally changed once they have decomposed after death. That's great, buddy. I figured you were about 4, but if you say you're 11, I'll accept it. When the Marquis de la Tallade Espinasse received word that in Pierrefour an individual had been found who had dwelt in a cave for 7 years, that is, completely encapsulated by the corrupting element of the earth, he was beside himself with delight and immediately had Grenouille brought to his laboratory, where he subjected him to a thorough examination. He found his theories confirmed most graphically. The fluidum letal had already so assaulted Grenouille that his 25-year-old body clearly showed the marks of senile deterioration. All that had prevented his death, Talad Espinasse declared, was that during his imprisonment, Grenouille had been given earth removed plants, presumably bread and fruits, for nourishment, and now his former healthy condition could be restored only by the wholesale expulsion of the fluidum. The fluidum, using a vital ventilation machine devised by Talad Espinasse himself. He had such an apparatus standing in his manor in Montpellier, and if Grenouille was willing to make himself available as the object of a scientific demonstration, he was willing not only to free him from hopeless contamination by earth gas, but he would also provide him with a handsome sum of money. Thanks, buddy. 2 hours later, they were sitting in the carriage. Although the roads were in miserable condition, they traveled the 64 miles to Montpellier. And I'm guessing it's Montpellier because I know there's a, what's it, Vermont? Or maybe it's Montpellier. In just under 2 days, for despite his advanced age, the Marquis would not be denied his right personally to whip both driver and horses and to lend a hand whenever, as frequently happened, an axle or spring broke. So excited was he by his find, so eager to present it to an educated audience as soon as possible. Grenouille, however, was not allowed to leave the carriage even once. He was forced to sit there all wrapped up in his rags and a blanket drenched with earth and clay. During the trip, he was given raw vegetable roots to eat. The Marquis hoped these procedures would preserve the contamination by Earth's fluidum in its ideal state for a while yet. Upon their arrival in Montpellier, he had Grenouille taken at once to the cellar of his mansion and sent out invitations to all the members of the medical faculty, the botanical association, the agricultural school, the chemophysical club, the Freemason lodge, and the other assorted learned societies, of which the city had no fewer than a dozen. And several days later, exactly 1 week after he had left his mountain solitude, Grenouille found himself on a dais in the great hall of the University of Montpellier, and was presented as the scientific sensation of the year to a crowd of several hundred people. In his lecture, Talleyrand Espinasse described him as living proof for the validity of his theory of Earth's fluidum letale. While he stripped Grenouille of his rags piece by piece, he explained the devastating effect that the corruptive gas had perpetrated on Grenouille's body. One could see the pustules and scars caused by the corrosive gas. There on his breast, a giant, shiny red gas cancer, a general disintegration of the skin, and even clear evidence of fluidal deformation of the bone structure, the visible indications being a clubfoot and a hunchback. The internal organs as well had been damaged by the gas: pancreas, liver, lungs, gallbladder, and intestinal tract, as the analysis of a stool sample accessible to the public in a basin at the feet of the exhibit had proved beyond doubt. In summary, it could be said that the paralysis of the vital energies caused by a 7-year contamination with fluidum letale Telliot had progressed so far that the exhibit, whose external appearance, by the way, already displayed significant mole like traits, could be described as a creature more disposed toward death than life. Nevertheless, the lecturer pledged that within 8 days, using ventilation therapy in combination with a vital diet, he would restore this doomed creature to the point where the signs of a complete recovery would be self evident to everyone. And he invited those present to return in 1 week to satisfy themselves of the success of this prognosis, which of course would then have to be seen as valid proof that his theory concerning Earth's fluidum was likewise correct. The lecture was an immense success. The learned audience applauded the lecturer vigorously and lined up to pass the dais where Grenouille was standing. In his state of preserved deterioration, and with all his old scars and deformities, he did indeed look so impressively dreadful that everyone considered him beyond recovery, and already half decayed, although he himself felt quite healthy and robust. Many of the gentlemen tapped him up and down in a professional manner, measured him, looked into his mouth and eyes. Several of them addressed him directly, and inquired about his life in the cave and his present state of health. But he kept strictly to the instructions the Marquis had given him beforehand, and answered all such questions with nothing more than a strained death rattle, making helpless gestures with his hands to his larynx, as if to indicate that that too was already rotted away by the fluidum letale Talleyrand. At the end of the demonstration, Talleyrand Espinasse packed him back up and transported him home to the storage room of his manor. There, in the presence of several selected doctors from the medical faculty, he locked Grenouille in his vital ventilation machine, a box made of tightly jointed pine boards, which, by means of a suction flue extending far above the house roof, could be flooded with an air extracted from the higher regions, and thus free of lethal gas. The air could then escape through a leather flap valve placed in the floor. The apparatus was kept in operation by a staff of servants who tended it day and night, so that the ventilators inside the flue never stopped pumping. And so, surrounded by the constant purifying stream of air, Grenouille was fed a diet of foods from earth-removed regions: dove bouillon, lark pie, ragout of wild duck, preserves of fruit packed from trees, bread made from a special wheat grown at high altitudes, wine from the Pyrenees, chamois milk, and frozen frothy meringue from hens kept in the attic of the mansion, all of which was presented at hourly intervals through the door of a double-walled airlock built into the side of the chamber. The combined treatment of decontamination and revitalization lasted for 5 days. Then the Marquis had the ventilator stopped and Granouilla brought to a washroom where he was softened for several hours in baths of lukewarm rainwater and finally waxed from head to toe with nut oil soap from Potassi in the Andes. His finger and toenails were trimmed, his teeth cleaned with pulverized lime from the Dolomites. He was shaved, his hair cut and combed, coiffed and powdered. A tailor, a cobbler were sent for, and Granouilla was fitted out in a silk shirt with white jabot and white ruffles at the cuffs. Silk stockings, frock coat, trousers and vest of blue velvet, and handsome buckled shoes of black leather, the right one cleverly elevated for his crippled foot. The Marquis personally applied white talcum makeup to Granouilla's scarred face, dabbed his lips and cheeks with crimson, and gave a truly noble arch to his eyebrows with the aid of a soft stick of linden charcoal. Then he dusted him with his own personal perfume, a rather simple violet fragrance, took a few steps back, and took some time to find words for his delight. Monsieur, he began at last, I am thrilled with myself. I am overwhelmed at my own genius. I have, to be sure, never doubted the correctness of my fluidal theory. Of course not, but to find it so gloriously confirmed by an applied therapy overwhelms me. You were a beast, and I have made a man of you, a veritable divine act. Do forgive me, I am so touched. Stand in front of that mirror there and regard yourself. You will realize for the first time in your life that you are a human being, not a particularly extraordinary or in any fashion distinguished one, but nevertheless a perfectly acceptable human being. Go on, monsieur. Regard yourself and admire the miracle that I have accomplished with you. It was the first time that anyone had ever said monsieur to Granouilla. He walked over to the mirror and looked into it. Before that day he had never seen himself in a mirror. He saw a gentleman in a handsome blue outfit, with a white shirt and silk stockings, and instinctively he ducked, as he had always ducked before such fine gentlemen. The fine gentleman, however, ducked as well, and when Granouilla stood up straight again, the fine gentleman did the same, and then they both stared straight into each other's eyes. What dumbfounded Granouilla's more, Jesus Christ, what dumbfounded Granouilla most was the fact that he looked so unbelievably normal. The Marquis was right. There was nothing special about his looks, nothing handsome, but then nothing especially ugly either. He was a little short of stature, his posture was a little awkward, his face a little expressionless. In short, he looked like 1,000 other people. If he were now to go walking down the street, not one person would turn around to look at him. A man such as he now was, should he chance to meet him, would not even strike him as in any way unusual. Unless, of course, he would smell that man, except for a hint of violets, had little odor as the gentleman in the mirror, or himself, standing there in front of it. And yet, only 10 days before, farmers had run away screaming at the sight of him. He had not felt any different from the way he did now, and now, if he closed his eyes, he felt not one bit different from then. He inhaled the air that rose up from his own body and smelled the bad perfume, and the velvet and the freshly glued leather of his shoes. He smelled the silk cloth, the powder, the makeup, the light scent of the soap from Potassi, and suddenly he knew that it had not been the Dove bouillon nor the ventilation hocus pocus that had made a normal person out of him, but solely these few clothes, the haircut, and the little masquerade with cosmetics. He blinked as he opened his eyes and saw how the gentleman in the mirror blinked back at him, and how a little smile played about his carmine lips, as if signaling to him that he did not find him totally unattractive. And Granua himself found that the gentleman in the mirror, this odorless figure dressed and made up like a man, was not at all that bad either. At least it seemed to him as if the figure, once its costume had been perfected, might have an effect on the world outside that he, Granua, would never have expected of himself. He nodded to the figure and saw that in nodding back it flared its nostrils surreptitiously. What's the next chapter? It looks pretty long. Well, we'll get through it. We shall get through it. Let me get a drink. Let me discard of this fool. Bye, bitch. And that's the end of him. I'm 31. The following day, the Marquis was just about to instruct him in the basic poses, gestures, and dance steps he would need for his coming social debut. Granua faked a fainting spell and, as if totally exhausted and in imminent danger of suffocation, collapsed onto a sofa. The Marquis was beside himself. He screamed for servants, screamed for fan beaters and portable ventilators, and while the servants scurried about, he knelt down at Granua's side, fanning him with a handkerchief soaked in bouquet of violets, and appealed to him, literally begged him to get to his feet and please not to breathe his last just yet, but to wait, if at all possible, until the day after tomorrow, since the survival of the theory of the fluidum letale would otherwise be in utmost jeopardy. Granua twisted and turned, coughed, groaned, thrashed at the handkerchief with his arms, and finally, after falling from the sofa in a highly dramatic fashion, crept to the most distant corner of the room. "Not that perfume," he cried with his last bit of energy. "Not that perfume. It will kill me." And only when Tallied Espinasse had tossed the handkerchief out the window and his violet-scented jacket into the next room did Granua allow his attack to ebb, and in a voice that slowly grew calmer, explained that as a perfumer he had an occupationally sensitive nose and had always reacted very strongly to certain perfumes, especially so during this period of recuperation, and his only explanation for the fact that the scent of violets, in particular, a lovely flower in its own right, should so oppress him was that the Marquis's perfume contained a high percentage of violet root extract, which, being of subterranean origin, must have a pernicious effect on a person like himself, suffering from the influence of fluidum letale. Yesterday, at the first application of the scent, he had felt quite queasy, and today, as he had once again perceived the odor of roots, it had been as if someone had pushed him back into that dreadful, suffocating hole where he had vegetated for several years. His very nature had risen up against it. That was all he could say, and now that his Grace, the Marquis, had used his art to restore him to the life free of fluidal air, he would rather die on the spot than once again be at the mercy of the dreaded fluidum. At the mere thought of a perfume extracted from roots, He could feel his whole body cramping up. He was firmly convinced, however, that he would recover in an instant if the Marquis would permit him to design a perfume of his own, one that would completely drive out the scent of violets. He had in mind an especially light, airy fragrance consisting primarily of earth-removed ingredients like yew of almond and orange blossom, eucalyptus, pine, and cypress oils. A splash such a scent, a splash of such a scent on his clothes, a few drops on his neck and cheeks, and he would be permanently immune to any repetition of the embarrassing seizure that had just overwhelmed him. For clarity's sake, the proper forms of reported speech have been used here, but in reality, this was a verbal eruption of uninterrupted blubberings, accompanied by numerous coughs and gasps and struggles for breath, all of which Granua accepted with quiverings and fidgetings and rollings of the eyes. The Marquis was deeply impressed. It was, however, not so much his ward's symptoms of suffering as the deft argumentation presented totally under the aegis of the theory of fluidum letale that convinced him. Of course, it was the violet perfume, an obnoxious, earthbound, indeed subterranean product. He himself was probably infected by it after years of use, had no idea that day in, day out he had been bringing himself ever nearer to death by using the scent. His gout, the stiffness, I can't read. His gout, the stiffness in his neck, the enervation of his member, his hemorrhoids, the pressure in his ears, his rotten tooth, all of it doubtless came from the contagious fluidal stench of violet roots. And that stupid little man, that lump of misery there in the corner of the room, had given him the idea. He was touched. He would have loved to have gone over to him, lifted him up, and pressed him to his enlightened heart. But he feared that he still smelled too much of violets, and so he screamed for his servants yet again, and ordered that all the violet perfume be removed from the house. The whole the whole mansion aired, his clothes disinfected in the vital air ventilator, and that Granua at once be conveyed in his sedan chair to the best perfumer in the city. And of course, this was precisely what Granua had intended his seizure to accomplish. The science of perfumery was an old tradition in Montpellier, and although in more recent times it had lost ground to its competitor, the town of Grasse, there were still several good perfumers and glovers residing in the city. The most prestigious of them, a certain Runnel, Runnel, was aware of the trade he enjoyed with the house of the Marquis de la Tellier Espinasse, as its purveyor of soaps, oils, and scents, declared himself prepared to take the unusual step of surrendering his studio for an hour to the strange journeyman perfumer from Paris who had been conveyed thither in a sedan chair. The latter refused all instructions, did not even want to know where things were. He knew his way around, he said, would manage well enough, and he locked himself in the laboratory and stayed there a good hour while Runnel joined the Marquis's major domo for a couple of glasses of wine in a tavern, where he was to learn why his violet cologne was no longer a scent worth smelling. Runnel's laboratory and shop fell far short of being so grandly equipped as Baldini's perfume shop in Paris had been in its day. An average perfumer would not have made any great progress with its new floral oils, colognes, and spices. Granua, however, recognized with the first inhaled sniff that the ingredients on hand would be quite sufficient for his purposes. He did not want to create a great scent. He did not want to create a prestigious cologne such as he had once made for Baldini, one that stood out amid a sea of mediocrity and tamed the masses. Nor was even the simple orange blossom scent that he had promised the Marquis his true goal. The customary essence of neroli, eucalyptus, and cypress were meant only as a cover for the actual scent that he intended to produce. That was the scent of humanness. He wanted to acquire the human being odor, if only in the form of an inferior temporary surrogate that he did not possess himself. True, the odor of human being did not exist any more than the human countenance. Every human being smelled different. No one knew that better than Granouilla, who recognized thousands upon thousands of individual odors and could sniff out the difference of each human being from birth on. And yet there was a basic perfumatory theme to the odor of humanity. A rather simple one, by the way, a sweaty, oily, sour, cheesy, quite richly repulsive, basic theme that clung to all humans equally and above which each individual's aura hovered only at a small cloud of more refined particularity. The aura, however, the highly complex, unmistakable code of a personal odor, was not perceptible for most people in any case. Most people did not know that they even had such a thing, and moreover did everything they could to disguise it under clothes or fashionable artificial odors. Only that basic odor, the primitive human was effluvium, was truly familiar to them. They lived exclusively within it, and it made them feel secure. And only a person who gave off that standard vile vapor was ever considered one of their own. It was a strange perfume that Granouilla created that day. There had never been a stranger one on earth. It did not smell like a scent, but like a human being who gives off a scent. If one had smelled this perfume in a dark room, one would have thought a second person was standing there, and if a human being who smelled like a human being had applied it, that person would have seemed to have the smell of one of two people, pardon, or worse still, to be a monstrous double creature. Like some figure that you can no longer clearly pinpoint because it looks blurred out and out of focus, like something at the bottom of a lake beneath the shiver of waves. And and to imitate this human odor quite unsatisfactorily, to as he himself knew, but cleverly enough to deceive others. Granouilla gathered up the most striking ingredients to Runnell's workshop. There was a little pile of cat shit behind the threshold of the door, leading out to the courtyard, still rather fresh. He took a half teaspoon of it and placed it together with several drops of vinegar and finely ground salt in a mixing bottle. Under the work table, he found the thumbnail sized piece of cheese, apparently from one of Runnell's lunches. It was already quite old, had begun to decompose, and gave off a biting, pungent odor. From the lid of a sardine tub that stood at the back of the shop, he scratched off a rancid, fishy something or other, mixed it with rotten eggs and castoreum, ammonia, nutmeg, horn shavings, and singed pork rind. Finally, mixed these, finely ground. To this he added a relatively large amount of civet. Mix these ghastly ingredients with alcohol, let it digest, and filtered it into a second bottle. The bilge smelled revolting. Its stink was putrid like a sewer, and if you fanned its vapor just once to mix it with fresh air, it was as if you were standing in Paris on a hot summer day. At the corner of the Rue aux Filles and the Rue de la Lingerie, where the odors from Les Halles, the Cemetery des Innocents, and the overcrowded tenements converged. On top of this disgusting base, which smelled more like a cadaver than a human being, Granouilla spread a layer of fresh, oily scents: peppermint, lavender, turpentine, lime, eucalyptus, which he then simultaneously disguised and tamed with the pleasant bouquet of fine floral oils: geranium, rose, orange blossoms, and jasmine. After a second dilution with alcohol and a splash of vinegar, there was nothing left of the disgusting basic odor on which the mixture was built. The latent stench lay lost and unnoticeable under the fresh ingredients. The nauseous part, pampered by the scent of flowers, had become almost interesting. And strangely enough, there was no putrefaction left to smell, not the least. On the contrary, the perfume seemed to exhale the robust, vivacious scent of life. Granouilla filled 2 flacons with it, stoppered them, and stuck them in his pocket. Then he washed the bottles, mortars, funnels, and spoons carefully with water, rubbed them down with bitter almond oil to remove all traces of odor, and picked up a second mixing bottle. In it, he quickly composed another perfume, a sort of copy of the first, likewise consisting of fresh and floral elements, but containing nothing of the witch's brew as a base, but rather a totally conventional one of musk, ambergris, a tiny bit of civet, and cedarwood oil. By itself, it smelled totally different from the first, flatter, more innocent, detoxified, for it lacked the components of the imitation human odor. But once a normal human being applied it and married it to his own odor, it could no longer be distinguished from the one that Granouilla had created exclusively for himself. After he had poured the second perfume into flacons, he stripped and sprinkled his clothes with the first. Then he dabbled himself in the armpits, between the toes, on the genitals, on the chest, neck, ears, and hair, put his clothes back on, and left the laboratory. And that's going to be it for now, bruvs. That's all.